And that brings us to our final hors d'oeuvre, a provocative bit of troubling from Margaret Bearman, um, who's going to talk about collective intelligence on the job. So, Margaret, great to get your perspective in the mix here. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And I am the closing, if you like. I'm sure you've had too many oysters and little bits and bobs. So thank you for bearing with me to this last minute. And I think it's interesting. I mean, Tim and I have worked together a lot. We have a similar background, but I'm quite new to the collective intelligence literature, and you'll probably see. And so forgive these sorts of big observations. My background is a bit in educational technology, a lot in recent years on workplace learning. And I want to emphasize here when I talk about workplace learning, the current work I do at the moment is not really about medical students or students in workplaces, although I do a bit of that. I do a lot of work of people learning on the job as they're doing the job. So my big collection of work on specialist training in medicine is probably my big focus at the moment. So I do other things as well, but I wanted to put that into the mix, which is why you can see I'm talking about the question about scale. And I guess I just want to say that I think workplaces can be sites of collective intelligence. And in fact, most of them are. They can also, given the chat that we've just had, be sites of tremendous collective stupidity. So lots of things play out in microcosm in workplaces. And I think there's something to be learnt there. And I felt like I might have to mount an argument as to why workplaces were points of collective intelligence, but having listened to the whole bunch of you all, I don't think I do. I think it's pretty clear that we join together, that we do more than the sum of our parts, and we do it all the time. But when I was looking at the collective intelligence literature, which I've come to this year, and what I've really noticed is it assumes a bit of the primacy of human agency, whether individual or collective. We've had some commentary about that in the chat. Where does intelligence lie? Where do boundaries lie? I'm interested in the post-human, or I have a bit of background in it. So that's I want to lay that out there so you understand how I might think about agency. I think it conceptualizes knowledge and knowing as context independent. We see that multiple times, I think. And this is really interesting to me. There's an emphasis on deliberative goal-oriented actions. And I find this quite appealing, but it's very different to the world that necessarily I sometimes live in. These are things that we are trying to do. We are trying to orchestrate a collective. And that's what, education for collective intelligence is, versus workplace learning, where you don't really think about so much about the deliberative nature. I mean, I've done teamwork training, teamwork education, all that sort of stuff as well. So that's an example of that a little bit more. If backgrounds are social, the material, the corporeal, and again, we've had some commentary in the chat, and I think that, people talk about systems. The other thing that's really backgrounded, which I'm really attached to at the moment, I'm doing a bit of work in at the moment, is the affect. It backgrounds the emotional, and that's another big, like intelligence, it's a huge definitional challenge. And it foregrounds the technological in pursuit of goals. And we see this over and over again. There's an implicit belief and explicit belief that technology can be used in pursuit of something. We've also heard today about how the technology can interfere with some of the goods. And the other thing I'll say, having come off this forum, though I didn't really read it in literature, is it actually also seems to me that everyone here, much of the concern has been about collective good. So there's also a strong moral dimension that runs through this literature, which I think is really interesting and attractive. So I'm going to turn to the swampy lowlands of practice for those of us who work in practice-based education. Shern's work is kind of, like that piece. And the swampy lowlands of practice for people who don't work in it is the stuff where, the Zoom doesn't work, and maybe Tim and I have had too many drinks together at last conference we were at and said things to each other, and, all that stuff that happens in the real world that actually means that collective intelligence looks quite different. It is all the interpersonal, somewhat embodied material way of being that is almost never what is intended. And I'm going to talk about how workplace learning deals with the workplace learning literature, not workplace learning itself, is conceptualized for many years now in terms of the practice term. You've probably all heard the term communities of practice, you know, the Lave and Wenger work in the, I think in the early 90s, you know, a whole host of folk. And the basic idea here really, and I draw mostly from Theodore Shatsky here, for people who know this literature, and some of you may. So I'm really talking here about the idea that a practice is an organizing principle of social existence. And so you could argue collective existence as well. And we see this practice, this primacy of practices. And what do I mean by a practice? It's a collective way of doing. So, for example, we're doing a conference right now. I'm talking at you. It's the end of the conference. You all know what it is to be in a conference. You know how to turn up. You know to raise your hand. You know how the discussion works. We're doing the practice of conferencing. It's associated with being an academic. And we don't have to really think about it that much. I'm coming to that sort of tacit knowledge that John was talking about. We've been organized in many ways, socialized, you might say, into the practice of conferencing. And so, to a certain extent, our collective intelligence, our collective ways of doing are laid out for us. And you can see here how agency shifts here. The practice itself helps us organize what it is we're doing. Knowledge and knowing, therefore, comes as being context dependent. It's mediated by both the practice, the collective way of doing, and the material and social stuff that comes around with that. Knowledge and knowing in this instance are mediated by a whole range, or mediates not really, are grounded in the ways of doing and the arrangements in which we exist. There's an emphasis, and again, I keep on using sort of Shatsky's language here, on common tacit ends, and ends are really different to goals. A goal is something that you think about, that you set, and an end is, you know, when you wake up in the morning, you think, I'm going to have some breakfast. You could think of it as a goal, but it's actually not really a goal. Sometimes your body just takes you down there and you go get breakfast, and it's done before you've even thought about it. So it's a much less deliberative thing. And we foreground in this world the social material and the corporeal, the embodied. And the social also encompasses both the interpersonal, but also the positions in which we are placed. There's a lot of, you know, different theorists and and the individual's backgrounds, individual goals and individualities, somewhat backgrounded. So when you mash these two literatures together, I come up with three provocations. First of all, the swampy lowlands. I wonder how, if we accept the organizing nature of the practice, and you may not, I wondered against this how collective intelligence should lean into what I see as its strength. It's kind of like this collective and agentic working towards an explicit shared goal. And I would also add, having listened to today, almost that moral dimension of a shared means of benefiting the world. But how does that intersect with the messy world of practice? And how do we sort of harness it across these two ways of thinking about existing, at the very least? Materiality, I think that we could have some more thinking about how material and technological arrangements, which ones are associated with successful experience of collective intelligence. As I read the collective intelligence literature, lots of lovely examples, you know, citizen science has waved a lot around a bit. There's deliberative democracy. What are the material and technological arrangements associated with that? And to consider more carefully, you know, contextualized ways of knowing that as seen through the material or materiality, slightly different things, but nonetheless. And finally, third provocation I'm racing through here is a social when we're thinking about collective intelligence, so many people have talked about this today. Whose agenda is being served and why? Who sets the goals if we're moving towards goals? Who benefits from the intelligence? And what positions are being reinforced? So there are three provocations. And then I wanted to take them into education. So this is the top of that photo. That was the swampy lowlands. This is the nice clean trees. And I wanted to talk about simulation-based education. I've worked in workplaces in simulation-based education a lot. It's a means of teaching teamwork. Lots of the examples here are simulation examples. And the reason I think simulation is important is it's the literature unto itself. And it has a lot of educational principles and practices I think could be really useful here. But the key in simulation is not fidelity. Simulation-based education is not meant to be the context, it is for learning. You lift people up from the swampy lowlands, you give them a bit of a taste of it into the trees, but you don't overwhelm them. And the point is that it's what they're surrounded by. It's what we call in simulation talk, briefing and debriefing are essential. The sense we make of these simulated activities. And you see them a lot. They lean into collective intelligence, things like educating the teamwork, emergency things in healthcare. I have done heaps of those, but also simulating political agenda setting, really huge in political science literatures. Environmental work often simulates trying to organise governance of a river system. There are examples of that. So I really think that this is, a parallel stream of literature that could be really useful to the conversation. Now, I
10
think I just
minutes up, Margaret.
slide. In collecting, that's it. We've got a lot of other stuff we already know about from workplaces, from education. What can it bring to this conversation?
All right. Thank you very much, Margaret. A view from workplace and professional learning and practice and simulation. Okay. Any reflections on that? Aldo, hand up for you.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Margaret. I felt very much at home in your talk.
Yes.
With the workplace, and I saw the Wenger, that's kind of the common reference we have there. So I think, actually, as you were talking, I was thinking that's the socio-technical interventions I was talking about. It's, as I said, it was more than just the tools. It's draping them in practices in that messy, swampy lowlands that you were talking about. It's how can we make that connection to that real world practice and get students involved in that in various roles. I think there may be a hook there.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you, sir.
No,
I was just going to say, I think the interesting difference between our perspectives, or the perspectives that we bring, and I don't think this is problematic, I think it's just a difference, is that I think that the practice is the organising place, site of learning, Schatzi calls it the site of the social, is quite a slightly different foregrounding, which even though I think the educational methods are the same. Does that make sense? So the focus here for even that socio-technical is on the artifact. Well, I would be suggesting that the practice itself might take primacy, which, as I said, I don't think half a dozen.
So that's exactly what I meant. So
okay.
I always say community informatics is 10% technology and 19% social and messy and messes. That's what you're normally working in. That's those practices you're talking about. So that to me really these, and the word portal was mentioned somewhere. I see these technologies as portals into something else, but that something else is much more important. That's that context, that's that practice that you're talking about, and we're still figuring out how to weave these portals into that larger real world scalable thing. And I have no clue yet exactly how to do that. Part of it, at least I know, is that you start mapping context, and then these maps mean nothing if you don't embed them in messy practices. And I think these workplace practices, that's exactly what students should really learn and be totally embedded in, because to a large extent, education itself is a form of simulation, what we teach students. But if they can get really access into that messy workplace practice that really matters, that the real world is, in different ways. And I think, Simon, I think also I've been reflecting on what you said. now I better understand. I read the comments, what you were saying. I don't see CI, collective intelligence, actually as having more problems than other fields in making these connections to the outside world. I think collective intelligence, everything we can bring to the table can actually help and can actually be of the essence to make these channels into that evolving, larger workplace, messy, real world context. So there's a lot coming together here, but I have to mull this over. But yeah, I'm really excited about this.
And I can see some comments in the chat about simulation. And so, yeah, I've done heaps and heaps of work on simulation, and it's really, I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary tools. It is a heap of work. And I think one of the things that people get a little bit, if you think about simulation as a practice, simulation-based education as a practice, I think one of the things that people get hung up about is on the scenario and on the thing of the doing. You know, we get hung up on the experience, but it's actually the stuff that goes around it that is probably the most, I mean, I feel like I'm talking to you, although this would be completely in your world as well too, but it's the stuff that goes around it that's so significant.
We will talk more some
Yeah,
offline.
yeah, great.
Okay. Other reflections on Margaret's practice pitch?
End of the run.
I was trying to think, you know, you're talking about how might things be different? Oh, Tim, I'm going to go to you. Yeah. Jump in. Oh, sorry, unmuting you.
There's also a question in
Thank
the
you.
chat.
Yeah, so obviously I loved it. You won't be surprised, Margaret, but I just want to, it's a comment really, is that I think one risk with collective intelligence is that we do funnel too much down one pathway, and we want it to connect with other pathways in order to make it more meaningful for a wider range of people, but also to bring in other people's perspectives to kind of challenge some of the claims that we make in a sort of more traditional collective intelligence pathway. So in a way that speaks to the nature of collective intelligence as well, isn't it? Just trying to test other perspectives against the stuff that we're saying. I'll just give it back to you if you want to comment.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're on the same page here, Tim. And I mean, you know, I think that's the whole glory of this symposium. And I'm going to try and answer that and more answer the question in the chat as well too, which is about how embodied and effective nuances. And I just want to go off of my current bonnet, which is about affect theory and affect and all that kind of world. And I think that's another example of a literature that I've only recently come to that has really been changing how I think about embodiment and so forth. And I guess one of the things, to answer Sandra's question about how affect can be thought in, is I think that I think that affect should be really, this is just me going off, I haven't given this a great deal of thought, but I really do, sort of my gut reaction is to say, I think that affect needs to be really 100% part of the conversation. A lot of the things that people have raised as being problems, as crises, are not just failures of collective intelligence. If you think about affect, you know, as Masumi would think about affect, is something that is collective. I mean, I share my emotions with you, you pass it on. The power of the mob is not a collective intelligence, it's a collective affect. And I think by separating out affect from intelligence, we're doing ourselves a little bit of a disservice. So that's an example, Tim, of where I think the parallel conversations could really come together in an attempt. You asked how we think about CI. I think one of the ways it can be interrogated is in simulation. I mean, simulation offers opportunities for affect as well, for how you feel, how we collectively feel. How does that make us collectively feel? So lots there. So I get all excited by these things. But I know it is like almost midnight wherever you guys are, and it's 10 a.m. where I am. So I'm sort of hitting my stride, and everyone else is coming down.
Okay. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Margaret. Let's final round of applause for Margaret and for everybody.